Since our last meeting when we were together, two of our most significant members have died during this period of lockdown. It is important that we should remember them now and recall all that they did for our movement, their witness to the Catholic faith and their service, not just to Forward in Faith, but to the whole of the Church of England. I am, of course, referring to those two great characters of Father Geoffrey Kirk and Canon Beaumont Brandie. They were both giants in the land. We can look back on their lives and the part they played in Forward in Faith with gratitude and pride. History will come to its own assessment of them both, when in the years to come their extraordinary period in our Church's life comes to be written. As we assess the record of their deeds, we cannot imagine what it would have been like without them. Father Kirk will feature prominently in many places in the years to come, through his writings, his speeches and articles. Father Brandie, who made things happen, helping to put policy into practice, to give us confidence and lead us forward. Their names will indeed live on, but today we can say that without any doubt, we would not be here now without them. So we give thanks for all that they did and were for us. Both of our friends were big personalities. You knew when they were around. They were not to be ignored. Both gave so much of themselves to our honoured place in the Church of England. First, Father Brandie. A priest for over 50 years and for much of that time at St Martin's, Brighton. He masterminded so many of the great events that we have had since the late 1980s. He had a fearful temper, and you easily caught the sharp edge of his tongue if you were being dilatory or not jumping to it on command. His language was often colourful, but he always pulled it off. He staged, managed and marshalled these events which live on in our memory in a way that lifted our spirits and gave us inspiration to carry on and keep going. If he had not been a priest, I'm quite sure he would have found his vocation in the world of the theatre. He knew how to do things with maximum effect, and you knew he was in his element as we lapped up the pleasure he gave us. He believed that religion should be fun, but he was also deadly serious in his conviction about the Catholic faith and how the Church of England must witness to it. He simply could not be stopped, and no one was ever going to control him. I well remember the Feast of Corpus Christi in St Martin's, at the end of their Fan the Flame mission for the Catholic parishes of Brighton, in which I was involved. At the end of communion, the trap door above the central altar opened, and amid a huge fluttering of rose petals, the Blessed Sacrament was lowered very slowly until it rested on its throne, while we sang, "Lo, he comes with clouds descending." The procession of the host then followed, and I said to myself, what came down must go up. And sure enough, the sacrament was hoisted up to the roof very slowly again, more rose petals, as we sang Alleluia, sing to Jesus. It was a moment to remember. Today we can recall those big national events he coordinated. In 1989, the Cost of Conscience in Church House, attended by 1,200 clergy or more, which was later described by the then Bishop of Manchester as just a tiny minority. The postcards, of which I still have one in my sacristy, printed after the event, would suggest otherwise. In 1994, the Festival of Faith at Wembley, then Forward in Hope in the Westminster Central Hall, with evensong in the Abbey. The amazing celebration on the 10th of June in Docklands, Christ Our Future. Over 9,000 people attended from all over the country. It was the largest event of its kind to be held in the UK to mark the millennium. The Archbishop of York presided, the Bishop of London preached. I had the task of being the MC, but I was very much under command. The whole event was executed with precision, and even though it had to start late to enable those coaches from the north that had been seriously delayed on the motorway on their way down, Father Bow took it all in his stride and altered the arrangements so that everybody could be present when the Mass started. Then finally there was the Stand Up for Jesus celebration to mark the 150th anniversary of the Society of the Holy Cross in 2005 during Low Week. Bow was in his element as he organised the synod in St Albans, Holborn, for which he sat in the front row as the 800 priests present sang the memorial hymn in our day of thanksgiving, accompanied by 4 hands on the organ with trumpets and drums. The theological conference at Christ the King over the next 3 days, the priest's pilgrimage to Walsingham on the day of the Pope's funeral. How inconvenient of the Holy Father to die just at that moment. Then, of course, finally the great event in the Royal Albert Hall on the Saturday at the end of that week. 5,000 people packed the Royal Albert Hall, and how we cheered as the great cross was hoisted up above the altar containing the relic of the true cross. It was indeed pure theatre. All Bow's work of preparation over the previous 2 years had come to fruition. Every year he would be on parade at the national pilgrimage to Walsingham in his naval uniform, in command of the proceedings. We loved seeing him there in control, even though I'm not sure he ever actually managed to get the procession totally seamless without stopping. He was an individual character, certainly a great character of determination and faith. He was a faithful priest. We will not see his like again. And then Father Geoffrey Kirk. He was in so many ways a larger-than-life person. He had his devoted following, and many people revered him and held him in such high esteem. Others were frightened of him, but listened to him with care and attention. Some disliked him intensely, but he was universally respected. Father Kirk was not someone who could be ignored, whatever you thought of him. His writings, his speeches, his ideas were much discussed and pondered over. You agreed or you didn't, but you needed to get your own thoughts in order before you entered the debate. And he loved debating. What many did not realise was that he did not expect you necessarily to agree with everything he said. He would put his case very much in an extreme form to make his point for others to consider. He also loved his opponents and the challenges they brought to his thinking. He was always one step ahead, as he could anticipate the other side of the argument. He was friends with Dr. Rowan Williams, who he particularly respected, commenting that when he became the successor to Augustine, that the problem was we now had an archbishop whom we liked. But that, of course, did not prevent him from taking on Dr. Williams. They would debate in public, and much of their discourse could be found in print. One of his closest friends was Jenny Standish, the chairwoman of Watch, with whom he would go on pilgrimage to Walsingham. He remained close friends with the current Bishop of Southwark, Christopher Chesson, to the end of his life. He had many friends indeed, and so many of us were on the receiving end of his hospitality and generosity. And generous he was, too, to a fault. He loved entertaining and was a superb cook. He also liked going out to restaurants, only the best, of course, and he had very high standards. He was, in every sense, a real foodie. He was one of the founders of Forward in Faith, being around from almost the first day of its conception. This vicar of St Stephen's, Lewisham, hitherto almost unknown, was discovered by the then secretary of the Additional Curate Society, Canon Prescott, who, along with others such as Father Christopher Colvin, Father Christopher Bedford, Father Stuart Wilson, Father John Broadhurst, all of whom had borne the brunt of the day up until the vote on the 11th of November 1992. Forward in Faith began on the 12th of November 1992, and Father Geoffrey was to give it shape and purpose. He was determined that Forward in Faith would be thoroughly democratic in all its formation. We forget that at first this organisation had but one goal: to see us safely across the river and bring us Anglican Catholics to where we belong, in other words, in communion with the See of Peter. But it soon became obvious that this was not the agenda of most of its members. Anglo-Catholics were divided. Many departed for Rome. It was a traumatic time for the Catholic movement. We were rudderless. There was no agenda, and we were in danger of losing our identity. But into this void stepped Father Geoffrey Kirk. He held his nerve, and he encouraged us to do the same. The triumvirate, which then formed between by now Bishop John Broadhurst, the Bishop of Fulham, Stephen Parkinson, our former director, and Father Kirk, was astonishing and gave form and purpose to the work of Forward in Faith. But in so many ways this was all the brainwave of Geoffrey. He set the agenda and gave it shape. This breathed new life into our movement and enabled us to regain confidence and hope. All was not lost. For those who remained, there was still a battle to fight. Geoffrey Kirk was determined to fight the liberalism and all its effects, as he so clearly saw it, of the Church of England, with all his strength and influence. And he had the intelligence to do it. Few could match him. So began his extraordinary contribution to the Catholic movement of the Church of England, which lasted for over 20 years. He was always one step of the game. So it was originally under the cost of conscience, his idea of alternative episcopal oversight, which in 1993 under the Act of Synod became extended episcopal care. As new structures were put into place, the Act of Synod became the basis for a new way of being church and holding on to the Catholic faith. The Act of Synod had begun something that had never been intended, but under Father Kirk's influence and direction of policy, it was soon to become a lifeline for many. The debate for women bishops was soon to be underway, despite the protestations of some. The Catholic group on Synod were divided, but Father Geoffrey would continually point out and warn that women bishops would follow, as sure as day followed the night and light comes in the morning. He would say, "It will happen." And how right he was. We can say that now, but many thought we could stop it. We couldn't, and we didn't. But Geoffrey had an idea: a free province. This was in many ways a controversial idea, but he had worked it out very carefully. Some saw it as schism, but it very rightly emphasised that it was still to be a province of the Anglican Communion. It was not a third province, definitely not, but rather a free province. And the concept of the word free was all important. We had to be free of the restrictions that the Church of England might put upon us, to work out our ecumenical relations and our desire for unity with Rome. All this was the vision of Father Kirk. It was to be a discussion document which deliberately set the stakes high, as you might do in any negotiation, in order to encourage debate along the right lines. The bottom line being, once again, alternative episcopal authority being established. But how was this to come about? Again and again in Synod, we lost one amendment after another, which would have given us, to a greater or lesser degree, this concept in practice: a province, alternative dioceses, which Dr. Williams had backed, bishops with parallel jurisdiction, and so on. Even the Archbishop's own amendment fell, which would have given some limited shape and meaning to the free province. By 2012, all seemed to be almost lost except for one thing: the amendment of 2006, which had called for an honoured place to be found for all in the Church of England. It echoed the wording of the Lambeth Conference resolution of 1998. Geoffrey did the wording. I had the task of putting it to the Synod, and it passed by a convincing majority. The Synod could not get out of it. It remained throughout the debates during the following 6 years the bottom line which could not be overturned, and which eventually led to the rejection of the draft measure first time round. It must be said that at this point, Father Geoffrey became, I think, disillusioned with the Church of England and felt we had turned our back on the principles of the Free Province. He could not see how the proposals which were at the foundation of the Bishop's declaration, which in many ways gave effect to the concept of alternative episcopal authority, were synonymous with what he had proposed, in all but name. It was to be a parting of the waves. When the new measure was passed with the provision it contained, he felt Catholics had lost the argument. Sadly, he resigned his living and joined the ordinariate, as he saw that as being the only form of provision left on the table. He wrote copiously for New Directions, sometimes under his own name, but more often than not under a variety of pseudonyms, depending on his subject or the angle he wished to take. He liked to provoke, but even if he was sometimes misunderstood, as he was, this was done kindly. His pen could be very sharp, but in fact he was an immensely kind and generous person. However, his was the idea and brainwave of Christ Our Future, the Millennium celebration, which was to be the largest yet of its kind, and one which could capture the imagination of so many far beyond the confines of Forward in Faith. It was 3 years in the planning, and nothing like it has been seen since, even in the Royal Albert Hall. But on these very public occasions, he so often took something of a back seat, probably thinking of what next, what still needed and should be done. His energy was boundless. The ideas kept coming, but his health too was failing with the onslaught of diabetes, and his many friendships somewhat faded in his final years. We were due to have lunch together in the Liberal Club 2 years ago, but sadly he was too unwell to make it, and we were never able to catch up since. As far as Forward in Faith is concerned, we owe him so much. And much has already been written by way of tribute in the Church Times and New Directions. The Bishop of Fulham has written, Stephen Parkinson has written, more will be written in the years ahead. But I think without any doubt we can say that we would not be here now as we are without him and his immense contribution. So today, as we meet in this assembly, we thank God for these 2 great priests, both men of conviction and devotion, full of faith, hope for the future, and whose love was infectious. Faithful servants indeed, whose hearts God had touched, and through them ours as well. And so we pray, rest eternal grant unto them, O Lord. May they rest in peace, as we now say, thanks be to God.